Wandering around Ireland or any country in Europe, or the world for that matter, you are likely to be assailed by the strains of Money, 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 Knowing Me, Knowing You, or Take a Chance on Me. That is how international and popular the Swedish pop group ABBA are and have been for decades. But in Giles Smith's new book, My, ABBA, Through the Ages, he looks back on the time when listening and liking ABBA just wasn't the cool thing to do. This year marks the 50th anniversary of Waterloo, a seminal moment in pop history that saw ABBA burst onto the music scene by winning the Eurovision Song Contest. Giles' book looks at the fashion, snobbery, critical judgment and ability of great pop music to transcend all of those things. Before I talk to Giles, let's remind ourselves of that winning Eurovision entry, Waterloo. Waterloo there from ABBA at the 1974 Eurovision. And I'm joined by Giles Smith now, who has written a book about ABBA, My, ABBA Through the Ages. Giles, you're so welcome.
Hello, Kay. Hi.
Can you recount that moment, that first encounter you had with ABBA on April the 6th, 1974?
Yeah, it's very rare that, isn't it, that you can account exactly for where you were, what you were doing the first time you hear a particular song or a particular group sing. And of course, obviously with ABBA and Waterloo, that was the case. So I was I was 12, going on 13, and sitting at home with my parents watching the Eurovision Song Contest. And it's just, I think for my generation, there were kind of two big television moments really. And one was the Apollo moon landings, and the other is ABBA singing Waterloo at Eurovision in 74. I mean, they really were both kind of equivalent in the way that they were impressive, and stayed with you.
They shook your world.
It was just very, very different. I think you have to remember just how boring the Eurovision Song Contest was in the 70s. I mean, it really, nowadays you look at it, it's a complete party, and it's wild and whatever else you want to say about it, it's not boring. But then the Eurovision Song Contest really was tame. Most of the songs were ponderous kind of ballads sung by people who looked very serious while they were doing so. And if the songs were upbeat, they were kind of upbeat in a sort of whimsical way. And it just wasn't, certainly if you were young, it wasn't aimed at you. And suddenly here come ABBA with this song that sounded exactly like the kinds of things you were excited about that were in the pop charts. It sounded a bit like T-Rex, Waterloo did, and it sounded a bit like Slade, and it sounded a bit like Sweet, and all of this sort of glam rock stuff that was going on. And that was completely unusual, and it sort of knocked you back a bit right there and then.
So after you saw them on the Eurovision then, did you pursue them? Did you search out maybe an album or what they were doing? Or did you kind of see them and more or less forget about them?
No, it exactly did work like that. So I went and bought the single, definitely. I mean, here's another strange thing to think about in 1974 was if they hadn't won, the chances of you hearing that song again were really minimal. I mean, the great thing about them winning on the night was they got to play it again that night, so you'd heard it twice. But, there was there's no internet that you can go to and look the song up and listen to it again. So it won, and therefore, it was a single. It was released as a single, and I got that single, I remember. But then, of course, the other thing about Waterloo is it's not like anything that ABBA subsequently did. There aren't any more glam rock songs in the ABBA catalogue. Waterloo's completely out there on its own. And as they start to release records, every one of them sounds different and moves on. So I eventually bought the 1975, they released an album which was simply called ABBA. And by then they'd released Mamma Mia, which one had heard on the radio and liked. But of course, Mamma Mia doesn't sound very much like Waterloo.
And do you
every
think they
time
had
they
a
released a single, then they...
Sorry, Jazz, did they have a grand plan when they went on the Eurovision? Sometimes it's said that they did, that it was just a launch pad for them.
Definitely. I think they saw it as a way of tunneling out. I think they felt stuck where they were. It was very difficult for them in Sweden to get their music out into the world. It was quite tough for a Swedish act to be accepted in Sweden singing in English. I mean, that really was kind of frowned on. And of course, you weren't really going to get your pop music right out into the world unless it was in a language that a lot of people use. So definitely, I think they spotted Eurovision and thought, let's go for that. They'd tried several times before Waterloo. They tried the previous year and failed to get in, to get past the Swedish heats. They'd written songs in the 60s for other people who had entered for Eurovision. I think it was always in their mind as their escape tunnel. But then, of course, they get out through that escape tunnel, but it comes with its own burden, because being the winner of the Eurovision Song Contest is not a particularly kind of cool thing to be.
Yes.
It becomes a bit of an albatross for them, because you are then a Eurovision Song Contest band, and Eurovision Song Contest bands were only ever one-hit wonders. So the plan was great and it worked, but also it backfired. They spent a long time getting over being a Eurovision act and trying to be regarded as something else.
Sorry, Giles, I think the criticism was very cruel. It was visceral, that this kind of, and almost racist in ways against ABBA. Definitely.
The extent of the slagging off that they get through the 70s until the beginning of the 80s, really, when they stopped being a band, is quite extraordinary to read now. And a lot of it has to do with the resistance to pop written by people who don't have English as a first language. And it's as simple as that. And I think you're right to call it racism. They get called Europop a lot in the writing about them in the 70s, or they're a Euro band. You know, I mean, people don't even do them the dignity of according them the Swedishness. You know, they're European in some kind of vague, amorphous way. And definitely in the UK, they suffered for that.
And then you said also that there was, I don't know whether it was criticism, but, you know, people wondered about, you know, two couples in a band. People wondered about, like, the gaudy outfits they wore. That all seemed to work against them.
Yeah, I think so. I think that the couple thing is very interesting, because that's just not what you expect a pop group, or certainly not a rock group, to be. There's nothing rebellious about a band that's made up of two couples. Pop groups were meant to be available in some way, and they really very specifically announced their non-availability by being two couples. So that was certainly something that people found a bit mystifying. And as you say, the costumes, I mean, you have to remember in the 70s, of course, there was a lot of that about. You had to work quite hard to be surprising in the middle of glam rock and wear things that people would go wow at. But they really did push that very hard, it has to be said. I mean, almost any television show appearance that you look back at now with ABBA on, there are like 4 separate crimes against fashion being committed on the stage at any one time. I mean, they did push that hard, and people, I mean, I think they did it wittingly and actually were probably found it quite funny, but people took them seriously on it and kind of called them out on it, definitely.
So let's listen to a track which I think is your favourite track, and we might just talk afterwards about whether these are very simple songs or complex songs. This is Knowing Me, Knowing You.
Walking through an empty house.
Knowing Me, Knowing You from ABBA. And my, ABBA Through the Ages is the book that Giles Smith has written about being, at times, a closeted ABBA fan. Just listening to that song there, and I know it's one of your favourites, you as a young man were a musician, you played piano, and you were working out some of the chords and melodies on those ABBA songs. And they weren't quite as simple as one might think on hearing it first or second time.
They're really not. They're very complex. I think, you know, when you listen now, this is the other thing, is they kind of transcend their time as well. They sound so gorgeous. That song in particular is a favourite of mine just because I think it sounds so amazing. It's really rich and it's lush, and there are odd things going on in the arrangement, even of that song, you know, Knowing Me, Knowing You. The bass guitar, if you listen to the bass guitar, is actually playing the melody line that the vocalists are singing, which is a very odd thing to do. It's not instinctively what a pop song would do. It's full of this kind of brightness and richness and depth, which they obviously worked very hard to achieve. And I think is one of the reasons the songs survive so well, because very often songs will have a sound in them that just immediately makes you think, oh, that's an 80s record, or oh, that's a 70s record. And it's quite rare that you feel that about an ABBA track. They just kind of float free. They're not like anybody else's, I suppose, either, is the other thing. They don't sound like anybody else's songs. But they are very... The melodies are complex. The harmonies are extraordinary. The force of the singing is very easy to overlook. I think from a distance you can think of ABBA as being quite soft, but if you actually listen to the power with which those two female voices blend and come at you out of most of the mixes, very true of Knowing Me, Knowing You, that's always quite surprising and quite startling. They're much kind of harder and firmer than they get credit for.
Now, Giles, you were talking there about the enthusiasm you felt when you saw them first and then buying their first records. But then, you know, it became a kind of thing of shame to be an ABBA follower, and you experienced that very acutely.
You know, you definitely had to hide it. And the trouble is that, you know, they coincide with punk and new wave. And at that point, really, they're pretty much washed away. There's no chance they're going to be cool. I had the cassette of the album I mentioned before, the album called ABBA that came out in 75, and I can remember turning that over so that in the box in which I kept my cassettes, you just see the blank back of it, in case anybody should actually come round from my friends and see it. I mean, they were that embarrassing to like. It's very hard to reckon with now when they're so popular and everybody is completely relaxed about the fact that ABBA are good. But back then it was a little bit harder to carry a torch for them, definitely.
And you think that the great turnaround happened with the release of their greatest hits in 1992, which is so much later, almost 20 years after Waterloo.
I think that is kind of the watershed moment. It slowly builds. But here's the other really interesting thing about ABBA. They've been around for 50 years, but for 42 of those years, they haven't really been a band. You know, they stopped doing what they were doing. In 1982, they gave up recording and touring. They hadn't done much touring anyway. But so they just kind of slipped off the radar and sat at home. And at the point at which they stopped in 82, they were probably as unfashionable as they'd ever been. You know, the 80s were coming and the 80s kind of swept them away for a while. But then slowly the music comes back, and it is all about the music. It's not about them. It's just the fact that these songs kind of stuck around. And the ABBA Gold album comes out and people start to listen to it again, and then a whole new generation discovers it. And various things happen. Benny and Bjorn appear with U2 suddenly in 1992 on stage. U2 kind of invite them on as guests. So that's kind of an interesting moment for their reputation, because you wouldn't put those two together. There's just suddenly a sense that, hang on, these songs are really good and they survive and they're worth holding on to. People's attitudes to the songs change as time goes by. And it's weird because it's got nothing to do with ABBA themselves. As I say, they're just sitting at home in Stockholm watching it happen.
And you're also a fan of their show, the Voyager show.
Yeah, I think it's an extraordinary thing. I was, again, like so much with ABBA, you kind of was skeptical going in. You know, I wondered what this thing was going to be. People talked about it as a hologram show. It's not actually a hologram show. It's a film. In fact, it's an incredibly clever three-dimensional film. But the whole notion of the hologram show is kind of naff and ghoulish, and when it's been tried in the past, it's not worked at all. So you go along to the ABBA show thinking, what on earth am I going to see here? The show in which the band aren't actually appearing, and yet it's amazingly emotionally involving. I mean, it's very beautifully done, for one thing. It's very very beautiful to look at, but also the songs play and suddenly you get caught up in it. It's an extraordinary thing.
Well, you have whetted our appetite for the hologram show and going back to our ABBA collection. My thanks to Giles Smith. My ABBA Through the Years is published by Gallery Books.